The year was 1944, and December had already painted the Ardennes forest in Belgium with layers of frost and snow that seemed to swallow every sound. American soldiers huddled in foxholes, their breaths forming small clouds in the freezing air, waiting for orders that would either save them or condemn them to another day of relentless combat. Among these men was Lieutenant James Harrington, a 28-year-old officer from Pennsylvania who had spent the last 18 months leading his platoon through some of the most brutal battles the European theater had ever seen. James wasn't the kind of man who sought glory or recognition. He was quiet, methodical, and deeply devoted to the soldiers under his command. His men trusted him completely, not because he gave rousing speeches or made grand promises, but because he had proven time and time again that he would put their lives before his own. On this particular morning, as the fog rolled through the dense pine trees surrounding Bastogne, James received a sealed envelope marked with the highest classification level he had ever encountered. The orders inside would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, duty, and the true cost of keeping secrets in wartime. James had grown up in a small mining town outside Pittsburgh, where his father worked underground for 30 years until black lung finally took him at 52. His mother raised 4 children on a seamstress salary, teaching them that honor meant doing what was right, even when no one was watching. These values shaped James into the kind of officer who checked on his men during the coldest nights, who shared his rations when supplies ran low, and who never asked his soldiers to take a risk he wouldn't take himself. By the time his unit reached Belgium in late 1944, they had fought their way across France, liberating small villages and pushing back German forces with determination that bordered on stubbornness. The bond between James and his platoon had been forged in fire, tested by loss, and strengthened by countless moments where survival depended on trusting the man next to you. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what he was about to read in that sealed envelope, or for the impossible choice it would force him to make in the coming hours. The envelope had arrived with a courier who looked barely old enough to shave, his uniform still relatively clean, despite the chaos surrounding Bastogne. James broke the seal carefully, his fingers stiff from cold and fatigue. The document inside was brief, maybe 200 words total, but every sentence felt like a punch to the gut. High Command had received intelligence about a German counteroffensive that would strike their position within 72 hours. The assault would be massive, involving 3 panzer divisions and thousands of infantry troops that would attempt to break through Allied lines and reach the supply depots behind them. But here was the part that made James's hands shake as he reread the words. His platoon, along with 2 others, had been selected for what the orders called a strategic sacrifice. They were to hold a specific crossroads outside Bastogne for as long as possible, drawing German forces into a prolonged engagement while the bulk of American troops repositioned to more defensible locations. The orders explicitly stated that reinforcements would not be coming, that resupply was impossible, and that the men assigned to this mission should be told they were simply holding the line until relief arrived. James was being ordered to lie to his soldiers, to send them into a battle they couldn't win, and to keep the true nature of their mission classified indefinitely. He sat in the ruins of what had once been a farmhouse, the classified document resting on a broken table in front of him. Snow drifted through gaps in the collapsed roof, settling on the paper like it was trying to erase the words written there. James thought about his men sleeping in frozen foxholes just 50 yards away. There was Private Tommy Sullivan from Boston, only 19 years old, who kept a photograph of his kid sister and talked about teaching her to drive when he got home. Sergeant Marcus Green from Alabama had a wife pregnant with their first child, a fact he shared with James during a quiet moment after they liberated a French village 2 months ago. Corporal David Chen from San Francisco played harmonica every evening when artillery fire died down, filling the darkness with melodies that reminded everyone what they were fighting for. These weren't just soldiers under his command. They were brothers who had saved each other's lives more times than anyone could count. And now James was being asked to march them towards certain doom while pretending everything would be fine. The weight of that deception felt heavier than any equipment he had ever carried, more crushing than the responsibility of leading men into combat. James spent the next 6 hours reading and rereading those orders, searching for any loophole or alternative interpretation that might change what he had to do. There was none. The strategic reasoning was sound from a purely military perspective. The German offensive needed to be slowed, and sacrificing 3 platoons to save several battalions made cold, calculating sense when you reduced human lives to numbers on a map. But James wasn't a number, and neither were his men. He thought about defying the orders, about telling his superiors that he couldn't in good conscience lead his soldiers into a trap. But he also understood what would happen if he refused. He would be relieved of command immediately, likely court-martialed for insubordination during wartime, and another officer would simply take his place and execute the mission anyway. His refusal wouldn't save anyone. It would only mean his men would die without him there to lead them, to fight beside them, to at least ensure their sacrifice meant something. The impossible mathematics of war had trapped him in a situation where every choice led to betrayal. Either he betrayed his men by lying about their true mission, or he betrayed them by abandoning them to follow orders under someone who might not care about them the way he did. That afternoon, James gathered his platoon leaders for what he told them would be a standard briefing. The 3 sergeants who joined him had been with the unit since training camp back in Georgia, and they knew him well enough to sense something was wrong the moment they saw his face. He laid out the mission as High Command had instructed, explaining they would be holding a crossroads that represented a crucial choke point in the German advance. He told them reinforcements would arrive once the tactical situation stabilized, that supplies would be dropped as soon as weather permitted, that they just needed to hold for 48 hours maximum. Every word felt like broken glass in his throat, cutting him from the inside as he spoke. Sergeant Green asked about artillery support, and James provided the coordinates he had been given, knowing they were for guns that had already been redirected elsewhere. Private Sullivan wanted to know about evacuation routes for wounded soldiers, and James sketched paths on a map that led to field hospitals, which would be abandoning their positions before his men ever needed them. The lie grew with each answer, expanding until it filled the entire room and pressed against James's chest until he could barely breathe. They moved out before dawn the next morning, 42 men marching through snow that reached their knees in places, carrying weapons and ammunition that represented their only chance of surviving what was coming. James walked at the front of the column, his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies that all ended the same way. The crossroads they were ordered to defend sat at the intersection of 2 narrow roads, surrounded by open fields that offered almost no cover and made defensive positions nearly impossible to maintain against armor. Whoever had selected this location understood exactly what they were creating. A killing ground where American soldiers would be exposed to overwhelming firepower with nowhere to retreat. The morning light revealed the full extent of their tactical nightmare, and James watched his sergeants exchange worried glances as they surveyed the terrain. But they trusted him, believed in him, and when he ordered them to start digging in and preparing defensive positions, they followed those orders without question. That trust felt like a knife between his ribs, twisting with every shovel of frozen earth his men moved while building fortifications that would ultimately prove useless. The first day passed in tense anticipation, with scouts reporting German troop movements in the distance, but no direct engagement. James used the time to ensure every man understood his position, his field of fire, his fallback routes that he knew would lead nowhere safe. He walked the perimeter constantly, checking on soldiers who were already exhausted from weeks of continuous combat and inadequate rations. Some of them joked about finally getting a quiet assignment, about holding this crossroads being easier than the push through France. Private Sullivan asked if James thought they would be home by summer, and James found himself saying yes, knowing it was probably the cruelest lie he had ever told. That night, unable to sleep, he wrote letters for each of his men, personal notes that he sealed and marked to be delivered to their families if the worst happened. He wrote about their courage, their dedication, their humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. He wrote about what they meant to him, about how privileged he felt to serve alongside them. He wrote everything except the truth about how they died, because that was still classified, still a secret he was required to take to his grave. The German assault began at 4 in the morning on the third day, announced by artillery fire that turned the frozen landscape into a hellscape of explosions and flying debris. James had been awake for hours, standing watch, while his men caught what little sleep they could manage. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, a rolling thunder of destruction that collapsed several of their defensive positions and killed 3 soldiers before the actual fighting even started. When the shells finally stopped, the silence lasted maybe 5 seconds before machine gun fire erupted from the tree line and German infantry began advancing across the open fields. James's platoon returned fire with everything they had, their rifles and machine guns creating a wall of lead that slowed but didn't stop the enemy advance. The Germans came in waves, professional soldiers who knew exactly how to exploit weaknesses in defensive positions and press their numerical advantage. For 6 hours, James and his men held that crossroads, inflicting casualties that should have made any rational commander reconsider the assault. But the Germans kept coming because they knew something James's soldiers didn't. They knew this was a deliberate sacrifice, a position meant to be overrun, and they were happy to oblige while American command repositioned forces elsewhere. By noon, James had lost 14 men, with another 8 wounded badly enough that they couldn't fight effectively. Ammunition was running critically low, and the promised resupply drops never materialized because they were never going to materialize. Sergeant Green pulled James aside during a brief lull in the fighting and asked point-blank if anyone was coming to help them. The desperation in his voice cut through every defense James had constructed around his conscience. He wanted to tell the truth, wanted to admit that they had been abandoned, that their deaths were considered acceptable losses in some general strategic calculation. But the orders had been explicit, the classification absolute, and James found himself repeating the same empty assurances about reinforcements being delayed and supplies coming soon. Green looked at him for a long moment, and James saw the exact instant when trust began cracking in his sergeant's eyes. That look haunted him more than the explosions, more than the screams of wounded soldiers, more than the knowledge that he was presiding over a massacre disguised as a military operation. If you've been following this story and want to hear more forgotten tales of American heroes, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. The second wave came with panzer tanks, their treads grinding through snow and mud as they approached the crossroads with mechanical inevitability. James's platoon had 2 bazooka rockets remaining, not nearly enough to stop 4 tanks supported by what looked like 2 full companies of German infantry. He distributed the rockets to his best gunners and told everyone else to focus on the infantry while he tried to coordinate something resembling an organized defense. The first panzer exploded in a brilliant flash when Private Chen scored a perfect hit on its ammunition storage. But the second tank simply adjusted its route and began systematically destroying their defensive positions with its main gun. Each shot from that cannon sounded like the world ending, a concussive blast that left ears ringing and men stumbling from the shockwave. James saw Private Sullivan take shrapnel across his chest and collapse into his foxhole, blood spreading across the frozen ground in a pattern that looked almost artistic in its horror. He saw Sergeant Green trying to rally men on the left flank, while German bullets kicked up snow all around him. He saw his entire platoon fighting with desperate courage against an enemy they couldn't possibly defeat, believing until the very end that their sacrifice served some larger strategic purpose. By late afternoon, only 16 soldiers remained combat effective out of the original 42 who had marched to this crossroads 3 days earlier. They had withdrawn to a small cluster of destroyed buildings at the center of the intersection, turning rubble into makeshift fortifications, while German forces surrounded them on 3 sides. James knew the end was coming, could feel it in the way ammunition ran out and weapons jammed, and men started looking at each other with resignation rather than determination. He gathered everyone close and told them they had fought magnificently, that they had held longer than anyone expected, that reinforcements would break through any minute now. More lies stacked on top of lies, a tower of deception that reached all the way to James's soul and made him question everything he thought he believed about honor and duty. Some of his men probably knew he was lying by then, probably understood they had been expendable all along. But they kept fighting anyway, because that's what soldiers do. They fight for each other, for the man next to them, regardless of what the generals and politicians decide behind closed doors. The final assault came. As darkness fell, German forces pressing from all directions, while flares turned night into artificial day and illuminated the carnage spread across that god-forsaken crossroads. James fought with his rifle until it ran empty, then picked up a weapon from a fallen soldier and kept firing until that one ran dry too. He saw Corporal Martinez take a round through the throat and go down choking on his own blood. He saw Private Anderson lose his left arm to a grenade and somehow keep crawling toward the enemy line with a pistol in his remaining hand. He saw courage and terror and loyalty all mixed together in those final moments, men dying for a cause they believed in, even though that cause had already abandoned them. When a German soldier finally tackled James to the ground and pressed a rifle against his chest, he almost felt relieved that the lying was over, that the impossible burden of keeping secrets while watching his men die could finally be lifted. He surrendered along with 6 survivors, all of them wounded, all of them shell-shocked, all of them wondering why their reinforcements never arrived. The Germans transported them to a prisoner of war camp 50 miles behind enemy lines, a sprawling complex of barbed wire and wooden barracks that housed hundreds of captured American soldiers. James spent the first week in medical isolation while doctors treated a concussion and shrapnel wounds he barely remembered receiving. When they finally moved him to general population, he discovered that word of the Crossroads defense had already spread among the prisoners. Men approached him with respect and sympathy, calling him a hero, saying his platoon's sacrifice had delayed the German offensive long enough to save thousands of American lives. James accepted their condolences while dying inside, knowing the truth he could never tell, carrying the weight of classified orders that had turned brave soldiers into pawns in a strategic game they never knew they were playing. He spent 8 months in that camp, 8 months of replaying every decision and wondering if he could have done something different, 8 months of nightmares where Private Sullivan asked about going home, and Sergeant Green asked if anyone was coming to help, and James had to tell them the truth he never could while they were alive. Liberation came in April 1945, when Allied forces finally pushed deep enough into Germany to reach the POW camps and free the men held there. James weighed 30 pounds less than when he was captured, his body marked by starvation and untreated injuries that would never fully heal. But the physical scars were nothing compared to the psychological wounds that made every waking moment feel like walking through broken glass. He returned to the United States in June, expecting some kind of recognition for his service, or at least acknowledgement of what his platoon had endured at that crossroads. Instead, he received orders to report to a military intelligence office in Washington, where 3 officers he had never met informed him that his entire experience at Bastogne remained classified at the highest level. They explained that acknowledging the deliberate sacrifice of his platoon would undermine public support for the military and potentially expose strategic decision-making processes that needed to remain secret. They told him he was forbidden from discussing the true nature of his mission with anyone, including the families of the soldiers who died under his command. They presented him with documents that praised his heroic defense, while carefully omitting any mention of the orders he received, the lies he told, or the betrayal embedded in every aspect of that operation. James sat in that sterile government office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and tried to argue that the families deserved to know their sons and husbands had died for a reason, that the truth mattered more than protecting institutional reputation. The intelligence officers listened with polite patience and then explained in very clear terms that revealing classified information would result in prosecution under the Espionage Act, likely imprisonment, and complete destruction of his military record, including forfeiture of all benefits and honors. They reminded him that 36 men had died at that crossroads, that speaking out wouldn't bring them back, and that the only thing his honesty would accomplish would be adding scandal to tragedy. They asked him to think about his mother back in Pennsylvania, about how she would feel watching her son go to trial as a traitor after surviving the war. They used every pressure point and psychological lever available to ensure his continued silence, and by the end of that meeting, James understood that he had two choices. He could protect himself and preserve some version of his life by keeping the secret, or he could tell the truth and watch everything that remained of his identity get systematically destroyed by the same government he had served. James chose silence, though calling it a choice felt generous when the alternative was professional execution and possible imprisonment. He returned to Pennsylvania in July 1945, moving back into his childhood home, where his mother asked questions about the war that he couldn't fully answer. She noticed how he flinched at loud noises, how he sometimes stared at nothing for hours, how he avoided crowds and struggled to sleep more than a few hours at a time. The army sent him to several doctors who diagnosed what they called combat fatigue and prescribed rest, along with encouragement to focus on positive memories. But James didn't have positive memories from Bastogne, only the faces of men who trusted him, and the weight of lies that grew heavier every single day. He tried to build some kind of normal life, taking a job at a manufacturing plant and attempting to reconnect with friends who had stayed home during the war. But every conversation felt hollow. Every interaction reminded him that he was carrying secrets that separated him from everyone around him. People called him a hero when they learned about his service, and each time someone said that word, he wanted to scream the truth about what really happened at that crossroads. The families of his fallen soldiers wrote to him occasionally, asking for details about how their loved ones died and whether they suffered. James responded to every letter with carefully crafted lies that honored the men while concealing the classified nature of their mission. He told Private Sullivan's little sister that her brother had been brave until the end, fighting to protect his fellow soldiers with courage that inspired everyone around him. He told Sergeant Green's widow that her husband had died, believing his sacrifice was protecting their unborn daughter, that his last thoughts were of the family he loved. Every word was true in spirit, but incomplete in substance. Descriptions of valor that omitted the fundamental betrayal woven through the entire operation. These letters became their own kind of torture, forcing James to relive that crossroads over and over while maintaining the official fiction that High Command had deemed necessary. He sometimes wondered if complete honesty would have been kinder, if telling these families that their loved ones had been deliberately sacrificed would at least give them someone to be angry at besides fate and circumstance. Years passed, and James's silence calcified into a permanent part of his identity. He married in 1948, a kind woman named Elizabeth who worked as a librarian and asked very few questions about his time in Europe. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and James tried to be the kind of father his own dad had been before black lung destroyed him from the inside. But the classified orders from Bastogne haunted every aspect of his existence, turning him into someone who couldn't fully trust authority and struggled to believe in the institutions he had once served without question. He watched the Korean War unfold and wondered how many other soldiers were receiving sealed envelopes that would turn them into unwitting participants in strategic sacrifices. He watched the McCarthy hearings and thought about how easily truth became flexible when government priorities demanded it. He watched America change through the 50s and 60s, civil rights movements and political upheaval and social transformation, all while carrying a secret that grew more poisonous with each passing year. In 1967, James received a letter from the Department of Defense informing him that the classification level on his Bastogne mission had been reviewed and would remain in effect indefinitely. There would be no declassification, no historical reckoning, no opportunity for the truth to emerge even decades after the events in question. The letter included a reminder that his obligations under the Espionage Act continued until death, that any unauthorized disclosure would still result in prosecution, that the government's commitment to secrecy remained absolute. James burned that letter in his fireplace and watched the paper curl and blacken while Elizabeth asked if everything was all right. He told her it was just some routine military correspondence, adding another small lie to the mountain he had built over 22 years. That night, he dreamed about the crossroads again, about Private Sullivan asking if they would be home by summer, and Sergeant Green wondering why reinforcements never came. He woke up at 3 in the morning, his heart racing, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool autumn temperature. Elizabeth held him while he cried for the first time since 1945, sobbing for men whose families still didn't know the complete truth about how they died. James's children grew up never fully understanding why their father seemed haunted by shadows no one else could see. His son asked about the war once when he was 12, curious about the medals stored in a box at the bottom of a closet. James showed him the Bronze Star and Purple Heart and told sanitized stories about defending strategic positions and fighting with honor alongside brave men. He couldn't explain that those medals felt like commemorations of shame, physical reminders that the army had praised him for successfully lying to soldiers who deserved better. His daughter noticed how he never attended Veterans Day celebrations or reunions with other soldiers who had served in Europe. She assumed he was simply modest, uncomfortable with attention, not understanding that her father avoided those gatherings because he couldn't risk someone asking the wrong questions or making connections that might expose classified information. The weight of secrecy had transformed James into someone who lived perpetually at a distance from everyone he loved, unable to share the experiences that defined him, and unable to explain why certain topics made him withdraw completely. In 1982, a historian researching the Battle of the Bulge contacted James asking for an interview about his unit's defense of a crossroads outside Bastogne. The historian had found references in German military records describing an unexpected American resistance that delayed their offensive by several crucial hours. He wanted James's perspective on tactical decisions and unit cohesion under extreme combat conditions. James declined the interview politely but firmly, citing health issues and faded memories. The historian persisted, explaining that James's account would be invaluable for understanding how small unit actions contributed to the larger Allied victory. James eventually stopped responding to letters and phone calls, letting silence be his only defense against questions he legally couldn't answer. Elizabeth asked why he was avoiding someone who just wanted to honor his service, and James said something about preferring to let the past stay in the past. She accepted that explanation because she loved him, because their marriage was built on respecting boundaries, even when understanding was incomplete. The Cold War ended, and James watched the Berlin Wall fall on television while thinking about secrets and the nature of institutional memory. The Soviet Union collapsed, and classified documents began emerging that revealed decades of covert operations and strategic deceptions. James wondered if his own story would ever be released, if some future administration would decide that 70 or 80 years was sufficient time for truth to remain buried. He read about the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and Iran-Contra, endless examples of how governments kept secrets and how those secrets eventually corroded the trust between citizens and institutions. He understood why classification existed, why certain information needed protection for legitimate national security reasons. But he also understood that his mission at Bastogne wasn't about protecting sources or methods or ongoing operations. It was about protecting the reputation of decision-makers who had treated human lives as expendable resources and didn't want that calculation exposed to public scrutiny. In 1994, at age 78, James was diagnosed with lung problems that doctors said might have originated from exposure to chemical weapons or industrial toxins during the war. The irony wasn't lost on him that his father had died of black lung from mining, and now he faced similar breathing difficulties from different causes. Elizabeth became his primary caregiver, managing medications and doctor appointments while James grew progressively weaker. During one particularly difficult night, struggling to breathe and loaded with pain medication that loosened his inhibitions, James almost told her everything. Almost explained about the sealed envelope and the classified orders and the impossible choice between betraying his men through lies or abandoning them through refusal. Almost described how Private Sullivan had bled out asking about reinforcements that were never coming, and how Sergeant Green had looked at him with dawning awareness that something was terribly wrong. But even then, even 50 years later, and facing his own mortality, the weight of those classification orders held. James bit back the truth and let Elizabeth believe his nightmares were simply the predictable aftermath of combat trauma. James died on March 15, 1998, taking his secrets to the grave exactly as the Department of Defense had instructed 53 years earlier. His funeral drew a small crowd of family members and a few neighbors who knew him as a quiet veteran who had served with distinction. No one from the military attended, no official recognition of his service beyond a folded flag presented to Elizabeth with mechanical precision. His children cleaned out the house afterward and found the letters he had written during that first night at the crossroads, personal notes for each of his soldiers sealed in envelopes that had never been delivered. They found his military records, documents that praised his leadership while omitting the classified nature of his mission. They found a photograph of his platoon taken in France 2 months before Bastogne, 42 men smiling despite exhaustion and uncertainty about the future. His children looked at those faces and wondered about the stories behind them, about what their father had experienced that marked him so deeply. They would never know the complete truth because James had followed his orders until death, maintaining operational security long after anyone involved in making those decisions had retired or passed away. The classified documents remain sealed in government archives, marked with restrictions that extend into the 22nd century. The families of the soldiers who died at that crossroads never learned that their loved ones were deliberately sacrificed as part of a larger strategic calculation. History records their defense as a heroic last stand that contributed to Allied victory, which is technically accurate but fundamentally incomplete. James Harrington carried the weight of impossible knowledge for 53 years, silenced by classification orders that valued institutional reputation over individual truth. His story raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of duty, the cost of secrecy, and whether soldiers who follow orders deserve to have those orders acknowledged when they result in deliberate sacrifice. There are no easy answers, only the recognition that war forces impossible choices, and sometimes heroism looks less like glory and more like carrying unbearable weight until you simply can't anymore.